The ancient stone cabin sat like a tomb against the howling Montana blizzard, its windows black as dead eyes. Jake Reaper Morrison kicked down the frozen door, his Harley buried somewhere in the white hell behind him. Blood dripped from his split knuckles onto the cabin floor as he stumbled inside, hypothermia clawing at his consciousness. What Jake found made his blood run colder than the storm outside. Children's drawings covered every wall, dozens of them, crayon stick figures with tears, messages scrawled in desperate handwriting, "Help us, we want to go home, please find us." Fresh food sat on the table, warm blankets were stacked nearby. Someone had been here recently. Jake Morrison wasn't just any biker. He was an ex-Navy SEAL turned outlaw, running from a murder rap he didn't commit. But those 20 years of Black Ops training were about to serve a purpose he never imagined. Because somewhere in these mountains, children were being held prisoner, and their captors had no idea that the wrong man just found their secret. The question wasn't whether Jake would help these kids. The question was, would anyone survive what he was about to unleash? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake's breath came in sharp bursts as he forced himself to move deeper into the cabin. The Hell's Angels patch on his leather jacket meant nothing now. Every instinct screamed at him to examine the evidence before him, but his frozen fingers barely responded to his commands. He stumbled toward the fireplace, noting the fresh ashes still warm in the grate. Someone had been here within hours, maybe less. The realization sent adrenaline surging through his system, momentarily pushing back the hypothermia's grip. A child's sock lay crumpled near the hearth, pink with unicorns. Jake's jaw clenched as memories of his own daughter flooded back. The daughter he'd lost in a custody battle 5 years ago when his criminal record made him an unfit father in the court's eyes. Sarah would be 9 now, about the age of whoever wore this sock. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course. He was 40 miles from civilization on a mountain road that barely qualified as a trail. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning his escape route into a death trap. But maybe that was exactly where he needed to be. Jake moved to the kitchen area, his tactical training kicking in despite his condition. On the counter sat an open box of children's cereal and several small plastic cups. In the sink, dishes soaked in soapy water. Real dishes for real children who had been here recently. A sound made him freeze. The wind, maybe, or maybe not. He crept toward the back of the cabin, past more drawings that made his stomach turn. One showed a stick figure man with angry red scribbles for a face standing over smaller figures. Another depicted what looked like a cage with children inside. The artwork was crude, but the terror was unmistakable. A narrow hallway led to 2 small rooms. The first contained bunk beds with rumpled sheets and scattered toys. Jake counted 4 beds, but signs suggested more children than that. Clothes in different sizes hung from makeshift lines. A teddy bear sat abandoned on the floor, one button eye missing. In the second room, Jake's blood pressure spiked. Maps covered one wall, marked with red X's throughout the region. Transportation schedules were tacked beside them. School bus routes, after-school program times, even summer camp pickup locations. This wasn't random, this was organized. A laptop sat open on a desk, screen dark but still warm. Jake's fingers hovered over the trackpad, then pulled back. He was smarter than that. Whatever was on this computer could be evidence, and his prints were already all over this place. But one document lay open beside the keyboard. A handwritten list of names, ages, and locations. 12 children between the ages of 6 and 11. Some names were crossed out, others had dates written beside them. Today's date appeared next to 3 names, with a notation, Transport, Facility B, Transport, Today. Jake's mind raced through the implications. A storm had stranded him here, but it would strand others too. If someone was moving children today, they'd need shelter. They might even come back to this cabin. The wind outside shifted, and through it came a sound that made Jake's blood freeze. The distant rumble of engines, multiple vehicles moving slowly up the mountain road. Jake killed the cabin's lights and moved to the front window. Through the swirling snow, he could see headlights cutting through the darkness. 3 vehicles, maybe 4. They were still a quarter-mile away, but climbing steadily toward the cabin. He had maybe 5 minutes before they arrived. 5 minutes to decide if Jake Morrison, the outlaw, would disappear into the storm, or if Reaper, the operator, would make his stand. The sock with unicorns caught his eye again. Sarah had one just like it. Jake began checking corners and sight lines, his SEAL training taking over. If these bastards wanted their cabin back, they could have it. But first, they'd have to go through him. The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin's weathered boards, creating an eerie symphony that made Marcus's skin crawl. He'd heard plenty of unsettling sounds in his 43 years, screams in back alleys, the crack of bones, the final gasps of men who'd crossed the wrong people, but this was different. This felt like the mountain itself was trying to tell him something. He limped toward the stone fireplace, his left leg throbbing where it had twisted during the crash. Blood had soaked through his jeans, mixing with melted snow to create dark stains that reminded him of crime scenes he'd rather forget. The cabin's previous occupants had left behind a small stack of dry wood, and Marcus quickly set about building a fire. The familiar ritual of survival helped calm his nerves. As flames began to lick at the kindling, orange light danced across the cabin's interior, revealing details that the dim daylight had obscured. What he'd initially mistaken for typical abandoned cabin debris, scattered papers, overturned furniture, random personal belongings, began to take on a more sinister appearance under the fire's glow. A child's sneaker, small and pink with cartoon characters, sat upright near the back wall as if someone had carefully placed it there. Marcus frowned, his weathered hands pausing as he fed another log to the fire. Why would a kid's shoe be in this godforsaken place? The nearest town had to be at least 50 miles away, and this cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years. He stood slowly, his injured leg protesting, and walked toward the shoe. As he got closer, he noticed other items scattered in the shadows, a small backpack with superhero patches, a broken toy car, and what looked like a child's drawing pinned to the wall with a rusty nail. The paper was yellowed and water-stained, but he could still make out the crude crayon figures, a stick-figure child reaching toward what might have been an adult, though the drawing was too damaged to be certain. Marcus's stomach tightened. He'd done terrible things in his life, committed acts that would make decent people recoil in horror, but he'd always drawn the line at hurting kids. Even in The Devil's Disciples, even during the worst of his criminal years, that had been his unwavering rule. Children were off limits, period. He pulled the drawing from the wall, studying it more carefully. In the bottom corner, written in a child's unsteady handwriting, were the words "Help us" and what looked like a name, Emma, age 8. The fire crackled behind him, casting shifting shadows that made the crude drawing seem to move in his hands. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. He began searching the cabin more systematically, looking for anything else that might explain the presence of children's belongings in this remote location. Under an overturned table, he found a torn photograph. It showed 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, standing in front of what looked like a school bus. Their faces had been deliberately scratched out with something sharp, leaving only their small bodies visible. On the back, someone had written dates spanning the last 2 years, along with cryptic notes: pickup successful, delivery confirmed, no complications. Marcus's hands began to shake, and not from the cold. He'd stumbled into something far worse than he'd imagined. This wasn't just an abandoned cabin, it was some kind of way station, a place where children had been brought against their will. The clinical nature of the notes on the photograph suggested an organized operation, something planned and methodical. He continued searching, his sense of urgency growing. In a wooden crate near the cabin's single window, he discovered more evidence. Additional photographs of different children, all with their faces obscured, more drawings clearly made by young hands, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be a ledger documenting arrivals and departures, with the cold efficiency of a shipping manifest. The dates in the ledger were recent, The most recent entry was from just 3 weeks ago. According to the notes, someone had delivered 2 packages and was expected to return after the spring thaw. Marcus realized with growing horror that whoever was responsible for this operation might still be active, might still have children somewhere. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but Marcus barely noticed. His mind was racing, trying to process what he'd discovered. Every instinct told him to grab his gear and get as far away from this place as possible once the weather cleared. He had his own problems to worry about, his own demons to outrun. Getting involved in something like this would mean exposure, attention from law enforcement, questions he couldn't answer without revealing his criminal past. But as he stared at the child's drawing in his hands, at Emma's desperate plea for help, Marcus felt something stirring inside him that he'd thought was long dead. Maybe it was conscience, maybe it was guilt over his own dark history, or maybe it was simply the last flickering ember of whatever humanity he had left. The storm raged on, trapping him in this cabin of horrors, forcing him to confront a choice he'd never expected to face. The Polaroid felt like ice between Jake's fingers as he held it closer to the dying firelight. The image showed a boy, maybe 10 years old, with sandy hair and terrified eyes staring directly at the camera. Behind him, Jake could make out what looked like concrete walls and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written in red ink, "Tommy, Day 3. Jake's stomach lurched. He'd seen plenty of ugly things in his 38 years, done some of them himself, but this crossed every line he'd ever known existed. His hands shook slightly as he shuffled through the remaining photos. Different kids, different days marked in that same crimson scrawl. Sarah, Day 7. Marcus, Day 12. Emma, Day 1. The dates on the backs told a horrifying story spanning the last 8 months. All recent, all local, based on the missing posters he now recognized from gas stations and truck stops throughout the region. Places he'd ridden through without paying attention, focused only on staying ahead of his own demons. Thunder cracked overhead, and Jake realized the storm had shifted into something more violent than snow. He needed to think, to process what he'd stumbled into, but the photos seemed to burn in his hands. Somewhere out there, possibly close by, someone was holding children captive. Maybe they were already dead. Maybe they were still suffering. He forced himself to examine each image methodically, looking for clues. The background was consistent. Same concrete walls, same hanging bulb, same sense of underground confinement. A basement or bunker, definitely not a house. The lighting suggested a single room, but large enough to hold multiple children based on the wider shots. One photo made him pause. In the background, barely visible, was part of a wooden sign mounted on the wall. He could only make out a few letters, Asians 7. Below it, what looked like an arrow pointing downward. Jake had spent enough time running from the law to know abandoned places, and this looked military. The concrete, the sterile environment, the official signage, it screamed decommissioned facility. He tried to recall what he'd passed on the mountain roads. There had been mentions of old defense installations scattered throughout these peaks, Cold War relics left to rot when funding dried up. A sound outside made him freeze. Not thunder this time, but something mechanical cutting through the storm. An engine, struggling against the weather but getting closer. Jake quickly shoved the photos into his jacket pocket and grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace. Headlights swept across the cabin's front window, casting wild shadows on the walls. The engine shut off, replaced by the slam of car doors, plural, at least 2 people, maybe more. Jake heard muffled voices discussing something, but couldn't make out words over the wind. Heavy footsteps approached the front door. Jake pressed himself against the wall beside it, poker raised. The handle turned slowly, deliberately. Professional. These weren't random hikers seeking shelter. Supposed to be empty, a gruff male voice said as the door creaked open. "Tire tracks in the snow," replied another voice, higher pitched, fresh ones. They'd seen his bike. Jake cursed silently, realizing he'd been so focused on getting out of the storm that he hadn't thought about concealment. Now he was trapped with evidence of kidnapped children in his pocket and unknown hostiles at the door. The first man stepped inside, shaking snow from a heavy coat. Jake caught a glimpse of military-style boots and what looked like tactical gear. In the dying firelight, he could see the outline of a weapon holstered at the man's hip. "Check the back rooms," the first voice ordered. "Whoever's here couldn't have gone far in this weather." Jake had seconds to decide. He could try to take them by surprise, hope his poker could beat their guns. He could attempt to slip out the back while they searched, or he could wait and hope they'd leave without finding him. The decision was made for him when a floorboard creaked under his weight. Both intruders spun toward the sound, hands moving to their weapons with practiced speed. "Oh, well," the first man said, relaxing slightly when he saw Jake's leather jacket and rough appearance. "Just a lost biker. Bad night to be on the road, friend." Something in his tone suggested this wasn't a rescue. Jake kept the poker low but ready, studying their faces in the firelight. The first man was middle-aged with military bearing, probably ex-army. His companion was younger, nervous, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. "Bike broke down," Jake said carefully. "Storm's getting worse out there." "Yeah, it is," the older man agreed, but his hand remained near his weapon. "Funny thing is, we know every person who has legitimate business on this mountain, and you ain't one of them." The photos in Jake's pocket seemed to burn against his ribs. These men weren't here by coincidence. The children's eyes reflected the firelight like trapped animals, wide with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Jake counted 5 of them huddled against the far wall, 3 boys and 2 girls, ranging from what looked like 8 to maybe 14 years old. Their clothes were dirty and torn, faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm still raging outside. The oldest boy, a scrawny kid with dark hair matted to his forehead, stepped protectively in front of the others. "Please don't hurt us," he said, his voice cracking. "We'll be quiet. We promise we'll be quiet." Jake slowly raised his hands, palms out. "I'm not going to hurt you, kid. What the hell are you doing out here?" "The bad man brought us," whispered one of the girls, a redhead who couldn't have been more than 9. "He said we were going on a camping trip, but then he locked us in the cellar." Jake's blood turned to ice. He'd stumbled into something far worse than he'd imagined. "What bad man? Where is he now?" "He left this morning," the oldest boy said, still eyeing Jake warily. "Said he had to go get supplies. He does that sometimes, leaves us down there for days." The kid gestured toward a corner where Jake now noticed a wooden trapdoor, slightly ajar. "How long have you been here?" "I don't know," the boy replied. "Weeks, maybe?" "It's hard to tell down there. No windows." Jake ran his hands through his wet hair, his mind racing. This wasn't just some random cabin, it was a goddamn prison. And these kids... He recognized the fear in their eyes. It was the same look he'd seen in the mirror as a child, back when his old man would come home drunk and looking for something to break. "What's your name?" Jake asked the oldest boy. Tommy Morrison." "All right, Tommy, I'm Jake. When's this guy supposed to come back?" "Usually takes him 2 or 3 days when he goes for supplies. But with the storm..." Tommy shrugged helplessly. Jake nodded, thinking fast. The blizzard was both a blessing and a curse. It would keep their captor away, but it also meant they were trapped. His bike was buried under snow, and even if he could dig it out, he couldn't navigate these mountain roads in this weather, especially not with 5 kids. "Listen to me, all of you," Jake said, crouching down to their eye level. "I'm going to get you out of here, okay? But first, we need to make sure you're safe when this bastard comes back." The youngest girl, a blonde who'd been silent until now, spoke up in a tiny voice. "Are you a policeman?" Jake almost laughed, despite the horror of the situation. With his leather jacket, tattoos, and criminal record, he was about as far from a cop as you could get. "No, sweetheart. But I'm going to help you anyway." He stood and began pacing, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Think," he told himself. What would Razor do? His old crew leader had always been good at planning, at thinking 3 steps ahead. But this wasn't about moving stolen bikes or evading the law. This was about protecting innocent kids from a predator. "Tommy, tell me about this guy. What's he look like? How big is he?" "Tall," Tommy said. "Taller than you. Dark hair, always wears this green jacket. He's got scars on his hands like burn marks." The boy's voice dropped to a whisper. "He likes to hurt us when we don't listen." Jake's hands clenched into fists. He'd known plenty of monsters in his life, but child predators were the lowest of the low. Even in prison, guys like that didn't last long. "Does he have weapons?" "A gun," said one of the other boys. "And knives, lots of knives." Of course he did. Jake mentally inventoried his own resources, his knife, his fists, and whatever he could improvise from the cabin's contents. Not exactly an arsenal, but he'd worked with less. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," Jake said, turning back to the children. "First, we're going to get you fed and warmed up. Then we're going to make this place as secure as possible. If this son of a bitch comes back before the storm clears, he's going to find out that his little hunting ground just became a war zone." Tommy looked skeptical. "You're just one guy. What if he brings friends?" "Kid, I've been fighting my whole life," Jake said grimly. "And I've never had better reason to win than I do right now." Outside, the wind howled like a banshee, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. These children had been abandoned by the world, forgotten by everyone who should have protected them. But they weren't alone anymore. Jake Novak might be a criminal, but he was about to become their guardian angel, whether he liked it or not. The wind had died to a whisper by dawn, but Jake's mind roared with questions that wouldn't quiet. He'd barely slept. The children's faces from those photographs burned into his retinas every time he closed his eyes. Now, as pale morning light filtered through the grimy windows, he found himself standing over the coffee table where he'd spread the evidence like some demented detective. 23 photographs, 14 different children, ages ranging from maybe 6 to 12, all of them with that same hollow look of terror that made his stomach twist into knots. Jake had seen plenty of bad things in his 34 years. Hell, he'd done plenty of bad things, but this was different. This was kids. He picked up one of the Polaroids again, a girl with pigtails who couldn't have been older than 7. Her eyes were wide with fear, and there was something else in the background he hadn't noticed before, a wooden beam with strange markings carved into it, symbols that looked almost ritualistic. A sound outside made him freeze, not wind this time, footsteps crunching through snow. Jake swept the photographs into a pile and shoved them under the couch cushions, his heart hammering against his ribs. He grabbed his jacket and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the boards he'd used to block the broken pane. 3 figures emerged from the tree line, moving with purpose toward the cabin. Even at this distance, Jake could tell they weren't hikers or lost travelers. They wore dark clothing and moved with the coordinated efficiency of people who knew exactly where they were going. And they were heading straight for his temporary sanctuary. Jake's hand instinctively went to the switchblade in his pocket, but he knew it wouldn't be much good against 3 men. His motorcycle was buried under a foot of snow, and even if he could dig it out, the engine would never turn over in this cold. The footsteps grew closer. Jake could hear voices now, low and urgent. "Told you we should have checked yesterday. Weather was too bad. Nothing we could do. If someone found the stash, nobody comes up here. Relax." Jake's blood turned to ice. The stash. They weren't just random visitors. They were connected to whatever sick operation had left those photographs behind. And they were about to discover he'd stumbled onto their secret. Moving as quietly as possible, Jake retreated from the window and looked for options. The cabin was essentially one room with a small alcove that might have once been a kitchen. No back door, no cellar, nowhere to hide except... His eyes fell on the narrow space beneath the raised bed frame in the corner. It would be tight, but it was better than trying to fight 3 men in the open. The voices were right outside now. Doors been forced, fresh tracks in the snow. Shit, someone's been here. Jake dove under the bed just as the cabin door creaked open. Through the gap between the mattress and floor, he could see boots, heavy black work boots that had seen plenty of use. The men moved through the space with familiarity, checking corners and muttering to each other. "Coffee's still warm," one of them said. "Can't have gone far, not in this weather. Check the stash." Jake watched as two sets of boots moved toward what he now realized was a loose floorboard near the fireplace. There was a creaking sound, then a pause that stretched too long. "It's been moved." "What do you mean, moved?" "I mean, someone's been through our stuff. Look at this. Photos are all mixed up." Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. He'd been so focused on looking at the evidence that he hadn't thought about putting everything back exactly as he'd found it. Whoever was here saw everything. "Fan out. Check the perimeter. He's probably trying to make it down the mountain." Two sets of boots headed for the door, but one remained. Jake could see them clearly now. Worn black leather with steel toes. The kind of boots that could do serious damage to a person's ribs or skull. The remaining man moved slowly through the cabin, and Jake realized with growing horror that he was checking hiding spots. The bathroom, the kitchen alcove, getting closer to the bed. Through the window, Jake could hear the other two calling to each other as they searched outside. Their voices were getting farther away, but that wouldn't last long. Soon they'd realize their quarry wasn't out there and would return to help with the indoor search. The boots stopped directly in front of the bed. Jake held his breath, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. In the suffocating darkness beneath the mattress, he gripped his switchblade and prepared for the worst. Whatever these men were involved in, whatever had happened to those children in the photographs, they clearly weren't the type to leave witnesses behind. The mattress above him creaked as someone sat down heavily on the bed. The basement door stood before Marcus like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. The metal handle felt ice-cold against his palm, and for a moment he hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, grab his gear, and disappear into the blizzard. He'd survived 20 years on the road by trusting those instincts. But the photograph of the missing girl burned in his memory. Sarah Chen, age 7, the same age his sister had been when their father's fists finally went too far. Marcus twisted the handle and pulled. The door opened with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo forever. A waft of stale air rushed up from below, carrying scents that made his stomach lurch, disinfectant, fear, and something else he couldn't identify. The wooden steps disappeared into absolute darkness. He clicked on his phone's flashlight and began his descent. The basement was larger than the cabin's footprints suggested, extending deep into the mountain's foundation. As the weak light swept across the space, Marcus's blood turned to ice. Metal cages lined the far wall, each barely large enough for a child to lie down. Thick chains hung from the ceiling beams. A folding table sat in the center, its surface stained with substances he didn't want to contemplate. But it was the wall of photographs that nearly brought him to his knees. Dozens of pictures were tacked to the wooden boards, school photos, family snapshots, newspaper clippings, all children, all missing. Red X's had been drawn over roughly half of them in what looked like dried blood. Marcus forced himself to examine the images, memorizing each face. Some were recent prints, the children wearing modern clothes and hairstyles. Others were faded and yellowed, dating back decades. This had been going on for years, possibly generations. A sound from upstairs froze him mid-step, the distant rumble of an engine cutting through the storm's howl. They were back. Marcus killed his phone's light and crept toward the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the floorboards above, he heard the cabin's front door slam open, followed by heavy footsteps and muffled voices. "Storm's getting worse," a man's voice drifted down. "Road's completely blocked now." "Good," replied another, deeper voice. "Means nobody's getting in or out for days." Marcus pressed himself against the basement wall, barely breathing. The footsteps moved around the main floor, directly over his head. Dust particles drifted down between the boards. "Check the shed," the deeper voice commanded. "Make sure our guests are still secure." Marcus's pulse spiked. Guests. They had children here, right now. What about the new one? the first voice asked. Boss wants her processed by tomorrow. She'll keep another night. Little thing's barely conscious anyway. The footsteps moved toward the front door, and Marcus heard it open again. One set of boots crunched through snow, heading away from the cabin. The other person remained inside, moving around with casual familiarity. This was his chance. Marcus crept up the stairs, pausing at each step to listen. When he reached the door, he pressed his ear against it. The floorboards creaked somewhere near the kitchen area. He eased the door open a fraction and peered through the crack. A massive man stood with his back turned, warming his hands over the wood stove. He wore a heavy winter coat and thick boots, and a hunting rifle leaned against the wall within arm's reach. Marcus slipped through the door and closed it silently behind him. The man was 3 times his size, but Marcus had learned long ago that size meant nothing if you moved fast enough and hit hard enough. He crossed the room in 4 silent steps. The floorboard under his left foot groaned. The giant began to turn, hand reaching for his rifle. Marcus lunged forward, wrapping his arm around the man's thick neck and squeezing with every ounce of strength he possessed. The man thrashed backward, trying to slam Marcus into the wall, but Marcus held on, pouring 20 years of rage into his grip. The struggle seemed to last forever, but gradually the man's movements grew weaker. Finally, he collapsed unconscious to the floor with a thunderous crash. Marcus grabbed the rifle and checked the chamber, fully loaded. Through the window, he could see a flashlight beam moving around a small outbuilding 50 yards away. The second man was still occupied with whatever horrors waited in that shed. He had maybe 5 minutes before the man returned. 5 minutes to figure out how to save children he'd never met from monsters who'd been hunting them for decades. Marcus looked down at the unconscious giant, then back toward the window where the flashlight beam continued its methodical sweep. His hand shook as he gripped the rifle, not from cold but from the weight of a choice that would define the rest of his life. The storm raged on outside, trapping them all in this nightmare together. The basement door groaned as Jake descended into darkness, each wooden step creaking under his weight. The stench hit him first, a nauseating cocktail of unwashed bodies, fear, and something else he couldn't identify. His flashlight beam cut through the blackness, revealing stone walls that wept with moisture. Then he saw them. 4 pairs of eyes reflected his light like startled deer, children, huddled together in a makeshift pen constructed from chain-link fencing and padlocked gates. Their clothes hung in tatters, faces gaunt with hunger and terror. The youngest couldn't have been more than 8, the oldest maybe 13. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, his voice catching. The children scrambled backward as far as the confined space allowed. The oldest, a girl with tangled blonde hair, positioned herself protectively in front of the others. "Please," she whispered, "we'll be quiet. We won't cause trouble." Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. In 15 years of criminal activity, he'd seen plenty of horrors, but nothing had prepared him for this. He raised his hands slowly, trying to appear non-threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. "I'm here to help." The girl's eyes narrowed with desperate suspicion. That's what they all say at first. Jake approached the fence carefully, noting the heavy-duty padlock securing the gate. His stomach churned as he took in the deplorable conditions, a bucket in the corner serving as a toilet, moldy sleeping bags on the damp floor, empty food containers scattered about. "What are your names?" he asked gently. The blonde girl remained silent, but one of the younger boys stepped forward. "I'm Tommy," he said in a small voice. "That's Sarah, and Katie, and Marcus. How long have you been here, Tommy?" "I don't know. A really long time. Sarah's been here the longest." Sarah shot Tommy a warning look, but the boy's need to talk to someone new, someone who might represent hope, overrode her caution. Jake's mind raced. The missing children from the photos upstairs, these had to be some of them, but how many others had there been, and where were they now? "Listen carefully," Jake said, kneeling beside the fence. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay quiet until I figure out how many people we're dealing with, okay?" Sarah's expression softened slightly. "There are usually 3 of them. Sometimes more come to visit, but 3 live here. They went to town today for supplies. How do you know? We hear them talking. They think we're just stupid kids, but we listen. They said the storm would keep them in town overnight. Jake felt a surge of relief mixed with urgency. That gave him time, but not much. The storm wouldn't last forever. He examined the padlock more closely. Heavy duty, but nothing he couldn't handle with the right tools. He'd spotted a toolbox in the main cabin. "I'll be right back," he told the children. "I'm going to get something to cut this lock." "Wait!" Sarah called out as he turned to leave. "You're really going to help us? You're not one of them?" Jake looked back at her frightened face, seeing something of himself in her wariness, the hard-earned distrust of someone who'd been betrayed too many times. "I promise you," he said, meaning it more than any words he'd ever spoken. "I'm getting you out of here tonight." He bounded up the basement stairs, his mind shifting into tactical mode. The toolbox yielded bolt cutters that should handle the lock, but that was just the beginning. 4 traumatized kids in a blizzard, miles from civilization, with no vehicle and killers who could return at any time. Jake grabbed every blanket he could find in the cabin, along with the remaining food supplies. His motorcycle wouldn't carry 5 people, especially not in these conditions. They'd have to hole up somewhere until the storm passed, then make their way out on foot if necessary. But first, he needed to know more about what they were up against. He returned to the basement with the bolt cutters and supplies. The metallic snap of the lock breaking echoed through the confined space. The children stared as he pulled open the gate. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you upstairs where it's warmer." They emerged from their prison hesitantly, clinging to each other. Jake guided them to the main room and wrapped them in blankets while he built up the fire. "Sarah," he said once they were settled, "I need you to tell me everything about the people who took you. How many, what they look like, what kind of vehicles they drive. Everything you can remember." The girl's jaw tightened with determination. "There's something else you need to know," she said quietly. "We're not the first ones they brought here." Jake felt ice form in his veins. "What do you mean?" "There were others before us. But when new kids arrived..." She swallowed hard. "The older ones disappeared. They told us they were being moved somewhere else, but we heard screaming from the woods that night. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling fire and the wind howling outside." The storm outside had intensified into a howling fury, but Jake barely noticed as he stared at the photographs scattered across the cabin's wooden floor. 13 faces stared back at him. Children ranging from perhaps 6 to 14 years old, their school photos crisp and heartbreaking in their innocence. Missing person flyers, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be handwritten notes created a macabre collage of vanished lives. His hands trembled as he picked up one of the photos, a gap-toothed boy with freckles and a baseball cap. The missing person flyer beneath it was dated 3 months ago from a town 40 miles north. Jake's stomach churned. He'd been running from the law for years, but this was something far more sinister than anything he'd ever encountered in his criminal world. A sudden crack from outside made him freeze. The wind, or footsteps crunching through snow. Jake quickly gathered the photos and papers, stuffing them back into the wooden box. His motorcycle jacket felt inadequate against the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Every instinct screamed at him to grab his gear and bolt into the blizzard, but the storm made escape impossible. He was trapped here with whatever 6 secrets this place held. Moving to the grimy window, he peered through the frost-covered glass. Snow swirled in thick curtains, making visibility nearly zero, but there, a flicker of light moving through the trees, a flashlight beam weaving closer to the cabin. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. He extinguished the candle he'd been using and crouched beside the window, watching the light grow stronger. 1 person, maybe 2. They moved with purpose, not like lost travelers seeking shelter. The beam disappeared, and Jake realized whoever was out there had reached the cabin's blind spot. He pressed himself against the wall beside the door, listening. The wind made it impossible to hear footsteps, but he could feel it, a presence circling the building. A soft scratching sound came from the back wall. Someone was testing the rear window. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the knife on his belt, a habit from years of dangerous living. But as the scratching continued, methodical and patient, he realized this wasn't some random encounter. They knew he was here. The scratching stopped. Silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then came 3 deliberate knocks on the front door. Not urgent, not demanding. Almost polite. The casual nature of it made Jake's skin crawl. "Hello in there," a man's voice, calm and friendly. "Saw your bike tracks before the snow covered them. Hell of a storm to be caught in." Jake said nothing, barely breathing. The voice sounded normal, even concerned, but every fiber of his being screamed danger. "Look, I know you're in there. Your bike's partly visible under that overhang. I'm not looking for trouble, just want to make sure you're okay. These mountains can be deadly this time of year." The doorknob turned slowly. Jake had checked it earlier, unlocked. He cursed his carelessness as the door began to creak open, bringing a swirl of snow and Arctic air into the cabin. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the white chaos beyond. Medium height, heavy winter coat, flashlight beam sweeping the interior. "There we go. Much better in here than—" The beam found Jake crouched beside the door. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. "Well, hello there." The stranger's voice remained pleasant, but Jake caught something else now. Amusement, like he'd discovered an unexpected present. "You gave me quite a start, hiding like that." Jake slowly stood, keeping his hands visible but ready. The man appeared to be in his 50s, with a graying beard and kind eyes that didn't match the Arctic calculation Jake sensed beneath the surface. "Rough night for a ride," the man continued, stepping fully inside and closing the door. "I'm Tom Mitchell, got a place about a mile up the ridge. What brings you to our little slice of nowhere?" "Bike trouble," Jake managed, his voice hoarse. "Storm caught me off guard." "They do that up here." Tom's flashlight beam wandered casually around the cabin, and Jake tensed when it passed over the area where he'd found the wooden box. "This old place has been abandoned for years. Not the most comfortable shelter, but it'll keep you alive." The beam lingered on the disturbed dust where Jake had been searching. Tom's smile widened slightly. "Find anything interesting while you were waiting out the storm?" Jake's hand tightened on his knife handle. The pretense was crumbling fast. Tom's friendly demeanor hadn't changed, but his eyes had gone cold and calculating. They stared at each other across the dim cabin while the wind howled outside, 2 predators sizing each other up. But Jake wasn't the same man who'd fled into these mountains. Those photographs had changed something fundamental inside him. 13 missing children, 13 families destroyed. "Depends," Jake said quietly, "on what you'd consider interesting." Tom's smile became razor-sharp. "Oh, I think we both know exactly what I mean." The basement door groaned open, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow his flashlight beam. Jake descended the wooden steps slowly, each creak echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. The air grew colder with every step, carrying a stench that made his stomach lurch, something between decay and disinfectant. His light swept across the concrete floor, illuminating scattered debris and what looked like chains bolted to the far wall. A metal table sat in the center of the room, its surface stained with something dark that had long since dried. Jake's jaw clenched as he took in the scene. This wasn't just a basement, it was a chamber of horrors. Movement in the corner caught his eye. He swung the beam toward it, revealing a small figure huddled against the wall. A girl, maybe 7 or 8, with matted blonde hair and eyes that reflected his light like a terrified animal's. She wore a dirty pink dress that hung loose on her skeletal frame. "Hey there," Jake whispered, crouching down to make himself less threatening. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The girl didn't respond, just pressed herself further into the corner. Jake noticed the metal shackle around her ankle connected to a chain that allowed her maybe 6 feet of movement. His hands balled into fists. "My name's Jake," he continued softly. "What's yours?" After a long moment she whispered, "Emma." "Emma? That's a pretty name." Jake kept his voice gentle despite the rage building in his chest. "How long have you been down here, sweetheart?" She held up 3 fingers, then seemed to think about it and added 2 more. Jake's heart sank. 5 days, maybe 5 weeks. Either was too long for any child to endure this nightmare. Are there others? Emma nodded toward the darkness beyond his flashlight's reach. Jake moved the beam and discovered 2 more children, a boy who looked to be around 10, unconscious or worse, and another girl slightly older than Emma, awake but staring blankly at the ceiling. The sound of a vehicle approaching outside made Jake's blood run cold. He killed the flashlight immediately, plunging them into absolute darkness. Through the basement ceiling, he could hear the rumble of what sounded like a truck pulling up to the cabin. "Emma," he whispered urgently. "Who are the people who brought you here?" "The nice man and lady," she replied, her voice barely audible. "They said they were taking us somewhere safe." Footsteps crossed the floor above, heavy boots that shook dust from the ceiling joists. Jake heard voices, a man and woman arguing about something. Their words were muffled, but the tension in their tones was unmistakable. Jake's mind raced. He could try to get the children out through the basement window he'd spotted earlier, but the older boy appeared unconscious, and the chains would need to be dealt with first. The voices upstairs were getting closer to what sounded like the basement door. He turned his phone's flashlight on its dimmest setting and examined the shackles. They were secured with small padlocks, cheap hardware store variety that he could probably break with the right leverage, but he needed time. The basement door opened above them. "Stay quiet," Jake breathed to Emma, then moved silently toward the stairs. He pressed himself against the wall just as footsteps began descending. A woman's voice drifted down, cold and clinical. "We'll need to move them soon. The weather's clearing and someone might have seen the smoke from the chimney." A man responded, his voice gravelly and impatient. "Should have taken care of this mess days ago. Now we've got complications." Jake gripped his knife, waiting. The footsteps stopped halfway down the stairs and a flashlight beam swept the basement. He held his breath, knowing that discovery now would mean death, not just for him, but for these children who had no one else. "They're still secure," the woman said. "Though the little one looks worse. We might lose her before the buyer arrives." Buyer. The word hit Jake like a physical blow. These weren't just kidnappers, they were traffickers. The children were merchandise to them, nothing more. The footsteps retreated back upstairs, and Jake heard the basement door close. But they hadn't locked it, which meant they'd be back soon. He had minutes at most. He turned the phone light back on and rushed to Emma. Working quickly, he inserted his knife blade into the padlock mechanism and twisted. The cheap metal gave way with a small snap that seemed deafeningly loud in the confined space. "Can you walk?" he asked as he freed her ankle. Emma nodded, rubbing the raw skin where the shackle had been. Jake moved to the unconscious boy next, checking for a pulse, weak but steady. The other girl watched him with hollow eyes as he broke her restraints too. "Listen to me carefully," Jake whispered to Emma. "We're getting out of here, but I need you to be very brave. Can you do that?" The little girl nodded, and for the first time since he'd found her, Jake saw a spark of hope in her eyes. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that felt more ominous than the howling wind. Jake crouched behind a fallen pine tree, watching the cabin through binoculars he'd found in Marcus's emergency kit. 3 hours of observation had revealed a disturbing pattern of movement around the property. 2 men emerged from a shed he hadn't noticed before, partially hidden by overgrown evergreens. They moved with military precision, checking perimeters, communicating through hand signals. These weren't random kidnappers or opportunistic criminals. This was organized. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "State police mobilizing, but road won't be clear for 6 hours minimum." Radio went dead. "Are you safe?" 6 hours. Jake's jaw clenched as he typed back, "Still recon. Something bigger here. Will contact when able." He pocketed the phone and focused the binoculars on the cabin's basement windows. Movement flickered behind the glass, a small shadow passing quickly. Then another. His heart hammered against his ribs. Those kids were still alive. A branch snapped behind him. Jake spun, hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt, but found himself staring down the barrel of a hunting rifle. Well, well, the lost biker. The man holding the weapon was tall, gaunt, with eyes like chips of flint. Marcus radioed about you yesterday before the storm hit. Said you might be trouble. Jake raised his hands slowly, mind racing. Marcus? That your buddy in the cabin? Was. The man's smile was cold. Marcus got careless, started having second thoughts about the operation. Weakness like that spreads. The implication hit Jake like a physical blow. Marcus was dead. The man who'd shown enough conscience to feel guilt about whatever was happening here had paid for it. Name's Coleman, the gunman continued, and you're about to become a very unfortunate casualty of this blizzard. Exposure's a terrible way to die. Before you pull that trigger, Jake said carefully, mind telling me what's worth killing for? Money? The kids? Coleman's laugh was bitter. Kids are just the product, friend. Demand's always been there. Rich perverts with specific tastes, people who pay premium for discretion. But the real money's in the network. We move merchandise across 3 states, coordinate with buyers from coast to coast. This little mountain operation feeds a very lucrative ecosystem. Jake's vision went red around the edges. He'd known evil existed in the world, had brushed against it in his own criminal dealings, but this was different. This was systematic predation of innocence. How many? He asked through gritted teeth. Currently, 8 kids in the basement. But we've processed maybe 40 through here over the past 2 years. Remote location, perfect cover story. Who's going to look for missing kids way up here? 8 children, 40 total. Jake thought of Emma's drawing, those desperate stick figures crying for help. His hands trembled with barely contained rage. Coleman stepped closer, rifle still trained on Jake's chest. You know what's funny? Marcus thought you might be the type to cause problems. Said something about your eyes, like you'd seen things. But I think you're just another drifter who's about to disappear without a trace. Jake's fingers found a loose rock by his feet. Maybe. But I've got one question first. Make it quick. Ever been stabbed by a man who's got nothing left to lose? Coleman's eyes narrowed in confusion, just as Jake hurled the rock at his face and dove sideways. The rifle discharged with a thunderous crack, splintering bark from the tree where Jake had been standing. He rolled, came up with his knife, and drove it deep into Coleman's thigh before the man could chamber another round. Coleman screamed and stumbled backward, blood spreading through his pants. Jake wrenched the rifle away and brought the stock down hard across the man's temple. Coleman crumpled into the snow, unconscious but breathing. Jake quickly zip-tied the man's hands with restraints from his bike's emergency kit, then dragged him behind the tree line. His heart pounded as he considered his next move. The gunshot would have alerted anyone else in the area. He had minutes, maybe less, before reinforcements arrived. Through the binoculars, he saw 2 figures emerging from the cabin, moving toward the sound of the shot. Both armed, both scanning the tree line where he was hidden. Jake checked Coleman's pockets, finding a radio, a set of keys, and a folded paper with what looked like shipping schedules and locations. Names, dates, and coded references that made his stomach churn. This operation was even larger than Coleman had indicated. The radio crackled to life. Coleman, report. What's your status? Jake keyed the radio, disguising his voice with a cough, false alarm. Thought I saw movement, just a deer. Returning to position. A pause. Copy that. Stay alert. Jake exhaled slowly. The deception had bought him time, but not much. Soon they'd realize Coleman wasn't coming back, and those 8 children were running out of time along with him. He chambered a round in the stolen rifle and began moving toward the cabin. The morning light filtering through the grimy windows revealed the full scope of what Marcus had stumbled into. 6 children huddled together in the corner, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The youngest couldn't be more than 7, while the oldest appeared to be around 12. They were dirty, malnourished, but alive. Marcus crouched down slowly, keeping his voice as gentle as possible. My name's Marcus. I'm going to get you out of here. The oldest girl, her dark hair matted against her scalp, spoke in a whisper. They'll come back. They always come back. How many of them? Marcus asked, his mind already calculating odds and escape routes. 3, she replied. Maybe 4. Sometimes there's another man. Marcus nodded, processing the information. 3 armed men minimum, possibly 4, in terrain they knew better than he did. His Harley was still stuck in the snow half a mile away, and even if he could get it running, it wouldn't carry 7 people down a mountain in a blizzard. He moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the boards. The storm had intensified overnight, turning the world into a white void. Visibility was maybe 20 feet at best. On one hand, it would make their escape more difficult. On the other, it would provide cover. When do they usually come? He asked the girl. Morning, sometimes. They bring food. Her voice carried the flat tone of someone who had learned to survive by expecting nothing good. Marcus checked his watch. 7:30 a.m. If these bastards were creatures of habit, he might have a small window. He turned back to the children, noting how they flinched when he moved too quickly. "Listen to me carefully," he said, pulling out his spare jacket and offering it to the smallest child, a boy who couldn't stop shivering. "We're leaving. Now. I need you to stay close together and do exactly what I say when I say it." The girl shook her head frantically. "We tried before. Tommy tried to run and they—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus felt that familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had gotten him into trouble so many times before. But this time he would channel it. This time it would serve a purpose beyond destruction. "I'm not Tommy," he said firmly. "And this time will be different." He gathered what few supplies remained in the cabin: a rusty knife, some rope, and a half-empty bottle of water. The children watched his every movement with the wariness of small animals who had learned that humans meant pain. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, but Marcus could hear something else beneath it, the distant rumble of an engine. His blood turned to ice. "They're coming," the girl whispered, and all 6 children immediately huddled together against the far wall. Marcus grabbed the rifle and moved to the window. Through the swirling snow, he could make out the dim glow of headlights moving up the mountain road. 1 vehicle, maybe 2. He had minutes at most. "Back door," he said quickly. "Is there a back way out?" The girl pointed to a door partially hidden behind a stack of moldy blankets. Marcus yanked the blankets aside, revealing a door that opened onto the rear of the cabin. Beyond it lay a steep slope covered in pine trees, barely visible through the storm. "That goes down to the old logging road," the girl said. "But it's too steep, too dangerous." Marcus shouldered the rifle and looked at the 6 frightened faces staring back at him. Dangerous was relative. What was definitely dangerous was staying here. "We're taking the slope," he decided. "I'll go first to test the path. You follow exactly where I step." The rumble of engines grew louder. Marcus could hear voices now, muffled by the storm but getting closer. He cracked the back door and felt the full force of the blizzard hit him like a physical blow. The slope was treacherous, covered in at least 3 feet of fresh snow over what looked like loose rock and fallen logs. One wrong step could send them all tumbling down the mountainside. But the alternative was worse. "Hold hands," he instructed the children. "Make a chain. If one person falls, everyone else digs in and holds tight." The oldest girl took charge of organizing the others, and Marcus felt a flash of admiration for her strength. These kids had been through hell, but they hadn't broken. The sound of car doors slamming echoed from the front of the cabin. Heavy footsteps crunched through snow, accompanied by rough voices that made the children cower. Marcus opened the back door fully and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a sledgehammer, but he pushed forward, testing each step before committing his full weight. Behind him he could hear the children following, their breathing sharp and frightened in the thin mountain air. The first gunshot shattered the morning quiet, followed immediately by angry shouting from inside the cabin. They had discovered the empty room. Time was up. The basement door slammed shut above them with a finality that made Jake's stomach drop. The lock clicked into place, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor overhead. Marcus had trapped them. Well, that's just perfect, Jake muttered, testing the door handle even though he knew it was pointless. The solid wood didn't budge. Emma grabbed his arm, her small fingers digging into his leather jacket. "He's going to hurt us now, isn't he?" Jake looked down at the terrified faces surrounding him. 6 kids, ranging from maybe 8 to 14, all staring at him like he held their fate in his hands, which he supposed he did now. The irony wasn't lost on him. Jake Reaper Morrison, wanted by 3 states, had somehow become their only hope. "No," he said firmly, "nobody's getting hurt, not on my watch." The older boy, David, stepped forward. "There's no other way out. We've tried everything. The windows are too small and they're boarded up from outside." Jake surveyed their prison. The basement was larger than he'd initially thought, stretching under most of the cabin. Ancient wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty mason jars and rusted tools. A single bare bulb cast sickly yellow light over everything. In one corner, he spotted what looked like camping gear: sleeping bags, a small camp stove, some food supplies. Marcus had been prepared for this. "How long have you all been down here?" Jake asked. "I don't know," whispered a girl with tangled blonde hair. "Feels like forever." David answered more precisely. "Some of us weeks. Emma's been here the longest, almost 2 months." Jake felt rage building in his chest. 2 months. This little girl had been trapped in this hell for 2 months while the world searched for her, while her parents probably cried themselves to sleep every night. A sound from upstairs made them all freeze. Footsteps, moving with purpose. Then came Marcus's voice, muffled but audible through the floorboards. He was on a phone. "Yeah, it's me. We have a problem." "No, bigger than that. Someone found the cabin. I don't know how, but he's asking questions about the kids." Jake pressed his ear to the ceiling, straining to hear more. The children clustered around him, silent and afraid. "I can handle it, but I need the cleanup crew. Tonight. Yeah, all of them. It's blown now anyway." The words hit Jake like ice water. Cleanup crew. All of them. Marcus wasn't just planning to kill him, he was planning to eliminate all the witnesses. Every single child. The footsteps moved away, but Jake had heard enough. They were out of time. "Listen to me," he said urgently, gathering the children closer. "We're getting out of here. Tonight. Before his friends arrive." "But how?" David asked. "The door's locked. The windows." "Forget the obvious exits." Jake was already moving, examining the basement walls more carefully. Old cabins like this often had root cellars or storm entrances. There had to be something. He started pulling items off the shelves, looking for any sign of a hidden passage. The children watched nervously as glass jars crashed to the floor. Behind a stack of rotted lumber, his fingers found what felt like a different texture in the wall. "Help me move this stuff," he ordered. Working together, they cleared away decades of accumulated junk. Gradually, the outline of a door became visible. Old wooden planks that had been painted over so many times they blended with the wall. Jake ran his hands along the edges, finding a rusty latch near the floor. When he lifted it, cold air rushed in. "Where does it go?" Emma asked. Jake peered into the darkness beyond. The passage sloped upward, probably leading to an exterior entrance that had been concealed from outside. Only one way to find out. Above them, they heard a vehicle approaching. Headlights swept past the small basement windows. "His friends are here," David said, voice tight with fear. Jake's mind raced. The passage might lead to freedom, but it could also be a dead end. And even if they made it out, they'd be on foot in a blizzard with 6 terrified kids. But staying meant certain death. "Okay, here's what we're doing," Jake said. "Single file, no talking once we're in there. David, you're in back. Make sure nobody falls behind. Emma, you stick right behind me." More vehicles were arriving. Through the windows, Jake could see flashlight beams cutting through the snow. "What about you?" Emma asked. "What if they catch you?" Jake knelt down to her level. "They won't. I promise you, kiddo. I'm getting you home to your parents." As he spoke the words, Jake realized something had fundamentally changed inside him. For the first time in his adult life, something mattered more than his own survival. The basement door rattled as someone tested the lock upstairs. "Time to go," Jake whispered, and led them into the darkness. The basement stretched deeper than Marcus had imagined, a labyrinth of concrete corridors that reeked of dampness and something far worse. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing steel doors set into the walls like prison cells. Each one bore a number scratched into the metal with crude precision. Sarah's hand trembled in his as they moved forward. The other children clustered behind them like frightened sheep. Their breathing echoed off the walls, creating a symphony of terror that made Marcus's skin crawl. He'd seen plenty of horrors in his 43 years, but this place felt different. Evil lived here. "How many more kids?" he whispered to Sarah, though he dreaded the answer. "I don't know," she replied, her voice barely audible. "They kept us separated most of the time. But I heard voices, crying." Marcus's jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed at him to get these kids out now, to run for the surface and never look back. But he couldn't abandon whoever else might be trapped down here. The old Marcus would have. The one who'd left his own brother bleeding in that alley 15 years ago because sticking around meant getting caught. But that man felt like a stranger now. They reached the first door. No sound came from within, but Marcus pressed his ear against the cold metal anyway. Nothing. He tried the handle, locked. The second door yielded the same result, as did the third. But at the fourth he heard something that made his blood freeze. Sobbing. Quiet, exhausted sobbing. "Hey," he called softly, tapping the door. "Anyone in there?" The sobbing stopped abruptly. "It's okay," Marcus said, fighting to keep his voice gentle. "We're here to help. My name's Marcus. I've got some other kids with me." A small voice emerged, muffled by the thick door. "Sarah? Is Sarah there?" Sarah pushed past Marcus, pressing her palms against the metal. "Emma? Emma, it's me." "Sarah!" The voice cracked with desperate hope. "They said you were gone. They said—" "I'm here," Sarah interrupted. "We're getting everyone out." Marcus examined the door's locking mechanism. Heavy duty, electronic. No way to force it without tools they didn't have. But then he remembered the keycard he'd taken from the unconscious guard upstairs. His hands shook as he pulled it from his pocket and swiped it against the reader beside the door. The lock disengaged with a soft click. The door swung open to reveal a girl who couldn't have been older than 10, huddled in the corner of a tiny concrete cell. Emma launched herself at Sarah, and the two children clung to each other with desperate intensity. "There are more," Emma whispered between tears. "At least 6 others. Maybe more in the other wing." Other wing. Marcus felt his heart sink even as his resolve hardened. This wasn't just some sick individual's private prison. It was an operation, industrial scale. They moved methodically from door to door, the keycard working on most but not all. By the time they'd cleared the first corridor, their group had grown to 9 children ranging from Emma's 10 years down to a boy who couldn't have been older than 6. Each rescue felt like a small victory, but Marcus knew their situation was growing more desperate by the minute. The children were weak, some barely able to walk. They'd need time to reach the surface, time to get away from this place, and somewhere above them, the rest of whoever ran this nightmare would eventually discover what had happened. "Marcus," Sarah tugged at his jacket, "there's something else, something you need to know." He knelt down to her level, noting how the other children watched them with haunted eyes that had seen too much. "What is it?" "The cameras," she whispered. "They're everywhere down here, and they're connected to computers upstairs. If someone's watching—" Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. Of course there would be surveillance. These people were too organized, too careful to leave anything to chance, which meant their every move had likely been monitored since they'd entered the basement, which meant they were walking into a trap. A sound from the corridor behind them confirmed his fears, the mechanical whir of elevator machinery. Someone was coming down. Marcus stood, his mind racing. 9 children, most of them weak from confinement, a single exit he knew of, and that was being cut off. His hand instinctively moved to the gun tucked in his waistband, but what good would that do against unknown numbers with these kids to protect? "Is there another way out?" he asked Sarah urgently. She shook her head, then stopped. "Wait, Emma, What about the maintenance tunnel, the one they used to bring in supplies? Emma nodded quickly. Behind the boiler room. But it's locked too, and really narrow. The elevator was getting closer. Marcus could hear it descending, bringing death with it. He looked at the frightened faces surrounding him and made his choice. They'd come this far. He wasn't leaving anyone behind, not this time. The cabin's floorboards groaned under Marcus's weight as he paced between the windows, watching the storm rage outside. 3 hours had passed since he'd sent the distress signal, and doubt gnawed at his gut like a hungry animal. The blizzard showed no signs of letting up, and somewhere out there, Whitmore was probably mobilizing his entire operation. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, helping the younger kids sort through the emergency supplies Marcus had scavenged from various hiding spots throughout the cabin. Her movements were efficient, almost mechanical, but he caught the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. The girl had been through hell, yet here she was, taking care of the others like some kind of miniature general. "How long do you think before they come?" she asked, without looking up from a can of beans she was examining. Marcus stopped pacing. The kid was sharp, too sharp for someone who should be worried about homework and friends, not survival and rescue operations. Hard to say. Weather's working against everyone right now. Tommy, the youngest at maybe 7 years old, tugged on Marcus's leather jacket. "Are the bad men coming back?" The question hit harder than any punch Marcus had ever taken. He crouched down to Tommy's eye level, noting the purple bruises that ringed the boy's thin wrists. "Not if I have anything to say about it, kid." But even as he said the words, Marcus's trained ear caught something that made his blood freeze. Through the howling wind came the distant rumble of engines, multiple engines growing closer. He moved to the window and peered through the frost-covered glass. Headlight beams cut through the swirling snow like angry eyes, still distant but approaching fast. "Everyone stay calm," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Sarah, get the kids to the back room, now." She didn't question him, just started herding the children toward the cabin's rear. Marcus did a quick mental inventory of his resources. His .45 with 2 clips, a hunting knife he'd found in the kitchen drawer, and whatever makeshift weapons he could grab. Against Whitmore's crew, it wasn't much. The engines grew louder. Through the storm, Marcus counted at least 3 vehicles, maybe 4, too many for him to handle in a straight fight, especially while protecting 5 kids. He needed to think like the criminal he'd once been, not the hero he was trying to become. The cabin's layout offered limited options. 1 main room, a small kitchen, and the back bedroom where the kids were now hiding. 2 windows in front, 1 on each side, and a back door that opened onto a steep drop-off. Whitmore's people would surround the place within minutes. Marcus grabbed the kerosene lantern from the table and quickly doused the main room in fuel from its reservoir. If he was going down, he'd make sure to take some of them with him. The smell of kerosene mixed with the musty cabin air as he positioned himself behind an overturned table near the front door. The vehicles stopped just outside the tree line. Car doors slammed, and Marcus heard voices shouting orders over the wind. He recognized Whitmore's commanding tone among them, along with at least 4 other distinct voices. Bad odds getting worse. "We know you're in there," Whitmore's voice carried through the storm. "You've caused me considerable trouble, Mr. Rodriguez, but I'm a reasonable man. Send out the children, and we can discuss this like civilized people." Marcus almost laughed at that. Civilized people didn't traffic kids or run underground fighting rings. He kept silent, knowing that every minute he delayed was another minute for potential rescue to arrive. Assuming his signal had gotten through, assuming anyone was coming at all. A shadow moved past the side window, then another. They were positioning themselves for a coordinated assault. Marcus's finger tightened on the trigger as he calculated angles and distances. The first one through that door was getting a bullet, no questions asked. "Your silence tells me everything I need to know," Whitmore called out. "Very well. Boys, light it up." The cabin exploded into chaos as windows shattered under a hail of gunfire. Marcus pressed himself against the floor as bullets splintered wood above his head. The overturned table wouldn't provide cover for long against this kind of firepower. Between the gunshots, he heard something else. the distant thrum of helicopter rotors cutting through the storm. His heart leaped with desperate hope, but the sound was still too far away. He needed to buy more time. Marcus pulled out his lighter and held it near a puddle of kerosene. "Back off, or I torch this whole place," he shouted. "You want the kids alive, right? Well, they're in here with me." The gunfire stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The helicopter sound was getting closer, but would it arrive before Whitmore called his bluff? And when it did arrive, would it bring salvation, or just more enemies? The storm continued to rage, and somewhere in the darkness, predators were deciding whether their prey was worth burning for. The gunshot echoed through the mountain air like thunder, sending a flock of ravens spiraling into the grey sky. Jake's ears rang as he pressed himself against the cabin wall. Marcus's lifeless body crumpled at his feet. Blood seeped into the snow, creating an expanding crimson stain that seemed to pulse with each beat of Jake's hammering heart. "Marcus!" Dr. Holbrook's voice carried from somewhere beyond the tree line, sharp with panic. "Marcus, report!" Jake's grip tightened on the smoking pistol. 2 shots left, maybe 3. He'd lost count in the chaos. Through the cabin's shattered window, he could see the children huddled together like frightened animals, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Emma clutched the younger boy, Tommy, while the others pressed against the far wall. The radio on Marcus's body crackled to life. "All units converge on the cabin. The subject is armed and extremely dangerous." Jake grabbed the device, switching it off before stuffing it into his jacket. His motorcycle lay buried somewhere under the fresh snowfall, useless even if he could reach it. The storm had intensified, transforming the forest into a white maze where visibility dropped to mere feet. Heavy footsteps crunched through the snow, approaching from multiple directions. Jake counted at least 3 distinct patterns, Holbrook and 2 others, maybe more. He ducked low, moving toward the cabin's back entrance where he'd first discovered this nightmare. "Listen to me," he whispered urgently to the children as he slipped inside. "We're getting out of here, but you need to do exactly what I say." Emma nodded, her young face etched with determination that reminded Jake painfully of his sister at that age. "There's a root cellar," she whispered back, "under the floorboards by the stove. It connects to a tunnel." Jake's eyebrows shot up. "Where does it lead?" "The old mine shaft, about 50 yards down the slope. We discovered it yesterday, but were too scared to try escaping." "Smart kids." Jake quickly assessed their situation. The front and side entrances were likely being watched, but if they could reach this tunnel unseen... A shadow moved past the front window. Jake motioned for silence, raising the gun toward the door. His hands, steady despite everything he'd been through, held the weapon with practiced ease, a skill he'd hoped never to use again. The door handle turned slowly. Jake held his breath, finger poised on the trigger. The children pressed themselves against the wall, Emma's hand covering Tommy's mouth to muffle his frightened whimpers. The door swung open with a prolonged creak. Dr. Holbrook stepped inside, his own weapon drawn, eyes scanning the seemingly empty room. Behind him, 2 men in tactical gear followed, their faces hidden behind ski masks. "Check the back rooms," Holbrook ordered quietly. "They can't have gone far." Jake waited until the tactical team moved deeper into the cabin before making his move. In one fluid motion, he rose from behind the overturned table and fired. The first shot caught Holbrook in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second shattered the lantern hanging from the ceiling, plunging the room into near darkness. "Run!" Jake shouted to the children. Emma didn't hesitate. She pulled up the loose floorboards near the stove with surprising strength, revealing a dark opening barely large enough for an adult. The children disappeared into the hole one by one, their small forms vanishing into the earth like frightened rabbits. Shouts erupted from the back rooms as the tactical team realized what was happening. Jake fired his last shot toward the sound, buying precious seconds. He dove toward the opening just as muzzle flashes lit up the cabin interior, wood splinters exploding around him. The tunnel was a tight fit, forcing him to crawl on his belly through the frozen earth. The passage reeked of decay and stagnant water, but it was their lifeline. Behind him, he could hear Holbrook's screaming orders, his voice twisted with pain and rage. The children moved quickly through the darkness, their smaller size an advantage in the cramped space. Jake's leather jacket caught on exposed roots and rocks, slowing his progress. His wounded shoulder, aggravated by the crawling, sent waves of agony through his body with each movement forward. After what felt like an eternity, dim light appeared ahead. One by one, they emerged into the abandoned mine shaft, gasping in the relatively fresh air. The structure was old but solid, carved deep into the mountainside decades ago when these peaks had been stripped for silver and copper. This way, Emma pointed toward a side passage. It leads to the main road about a mile down. Jake nodded, though he wondered if they'd make it that far. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Holbrook's people would be searching every possible escape route. But for the first time since this nightmare began, they had a real chance. As they moved deeper into the mine, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part still lay ahead. The children huddled behind Marcus as Dr. Reeves stepped into the cabin's main room, his calm demeanor more terrifying than any rage. Blood seeped through his torn jacket where Marcus had shot him, but he moved with unsettling steadiness, like a predator who'd merely been inconvenienced. "You've caused quite a mess, Mr. Kane." Reeves surveyed the overturned furniture and broken glass with clinical detachment. "Though I suppose chaos follows you wherever you go." Marcus kept his gun trained on the man's chest, acutely aware of the dwindling ammunition. "Stay back, it's over." "Is it?" Reeves tilted his head, studying Marcus with those cold, analytical eyes. "You're bleeding, exhausted, and trapped in a blizzard with 5 traumatized children. Where exactly do you think you're going?" Emma's small hand gripped Marcus's jacket. He could feel her trembling, could sense the other kid's terror radiating behind him. They'd been through hell already, and now their nightmare was walking through the door wearing a physician's coat. "The basement," Reeves continued conversationally, dabbing at his wound. "Did you see my work down there? Years of research, Marcus. Breakthrough discoveries about pain tolerance, psychological conditioning, the malleable nature of young minds under extreme stress. You're sick." "I'm a visionary." Reeves's voice hardened. "Do you know how many advances in medicine came from unorthodox research? The data I've collected will revolutionize our understanding of human resilience." Marcus fought the urge to empty his clip into the man. But with limited bullets and Reeves's backup somewhere in the storm, he needed to be smart. The other kids, where are they? Some didn't survive the process. Others. Reeves shrugged with chilling indifference. The weak ones serve their purpose and are disposed of. These 5 showed particular promise. Behind Marcus, Tommy whimpered. The sound cut through Marcus like a blade, stoking the fury he'd kept barely contained. This monster had stolen these children's innocence, turned them into lab rats for his twisted experiments. "You won't touch them again," Marcus growled. "Actually, I will." Reeves reached slowly into his jacket. "You see, you've disrupted months of careful work. I can't simply let you walk away." Marcus tensed, finger on the trigger, but Reeves pulled out a small device instead of a weapon. A radio. "Dr. Henley, we have a situation at the primary site." He spoke into it calmly. "Initiate containment protocol." Static crackled, then a woman's voice responded, "Copy that, Doctor. ETA 5 minutes." Marcus's mind raced. 5 minutes until reinforcements arrived. The storm still raged outside, making escape treacherous with the children, but staying meant certain death. He glanced at the window, seeing nothing but swirling white through the glass. "You're wondering about your options," Reeves observed. "Let me save you the trouble. Surrender now, and I'll make their deaths quick. Continue this futile resistance, and I'll ensure they suffer extensively before the end." "Go to hell." "I've been there, Mr. Kane. I've walked through it and emerged with purpose." Reeves stepped closer, ignoring the gun pointed at him. "These children are already broken. Look at them. Hollow, damaged, barely functional. I'm offering them release from their pain." Marcus felt Emma press closer against his back. Despite everything she'd endured, despite the trauma etched into her young face, she wasn't broken. None of them were. Damaged, yes, but not destroyed. They'd survived because something inside them refused to surrender, just like he was refusing to surrender now. "Emma," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off Reeves. "Remember what we talked about? The back door?" "Yes," she whispered. "Take the others. On my signal, run. Don't look back." "But Marcus, trust me." Reeves smiled coldly. "Touching. The criminal finds his conscience in the final moments. But you can't save them, Marcus. You never could." The radio crackled again. "2 minutes out, Doctor." Marcus calculated distances, angles, the precious seconds he'd need. The children would have to navigate the storm, but at least in the wilderness they'd have a chance. Better to die free than caged in Reeves's laboratory of horrors. "Now!" Marcus shouted. Emma grabbed Sarah and Tommy while the older boys flanked them. They rushed toward the cabin's rear exit as Marcus pivoted, keeping his weapon aimed at Reeves. The doctor lunged forward with surprising speed, but Marcus was ready. He squeezed the trigger twice, the shots echoing through the cabin like thunder. Reeves stumbled backward, dark stains spreading across his chest, but somehow remained standing. "You can't stop this," he gasped, blood frothing on his lips. "Too many involved, too much invested." Marcus backed toward the door, hearing the children struggling with the frozen exit. Through the front windows, he spotted lights cutting through the blizzard, vehicles approaching fast. Time was up. The basement door slammed shut behind them with a finality that made Jake's stomach drop. Heavy footsteps thundered overhead, accompanied by shouting voices. Too many voices. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing concrete walls stained with moisture, and something darker he didn't want to identify. "This way," whispered Sarah, the oldest of the children, tugging at his leather jacket. Her face was gaunt, eyes too old for her 12 years. "There's another way out, but we have to be quiet." Jake nodded, following her deeper into the maze of underground tunnels that stretched beneath the cabin. The other 3 children, twin boys who couldn't be older than 8, and a girl with matted blonde hair, stayed close behind him, their bare feet silent on the cold concrete. The sound of splintering wood echoed from above. They'd found the hidden entrance. "How long have you known about this place?" Jake asked Sarah in a low voice, his hand instinctively moving to the gun tucked in his waistband. "Since Tommy found it last week," she replied, glancing back at one of the twins. "We've been planning, waiting for the right moment." The tunnel curved sharply to the left, and Jake could feel a slight breeze against his face, fresh air. Hope flickered in his chest, but the voices behind them were getting closer. Flashlight beams began dancing on the tunnel walls. There, Sarah pointed ahead to where the tunnel ended, in what looked like a natural cave opening. "It comes out near the old mine shaft, about half a mile down the mountain." Jake could hear them now, boots on concrete, the static crackle of radios. At least 4 men, maybe more. He thought about the evidence he'd found upstairs, the photographs, the journal detailing months of planning. This wasn't some random opportunity. It was an organized operation that had been running for years. "Listen to me," he said, crouching down to meet the children's eyes. "When we get outside, you run straight down that mountain. Don't stop. Don't look back. There's a road about 2 miles down. Follow it until you see lights." "What about you?" Sarah asked, and Jake was struck by the protective way she positioned herself in front of the younger ones. "I'm going to make sure they don't follow." The cave opening was partially concealed by hanging roots and ice formations, but Jake could see gray daylight filtering through. The blizzard had stopped, which was good for the kids but bad for staying hidden. Their tracks would be visible in the fresh snow. He helped each child through the narrow opening, his heart hammering as the voices in the tunnel grew louder. They were close now, maybe 5 minutes behind, probably less. The landscape outside was blindingly white, rolling hills of snow stretching down toward the tree line. Jake could see the dark mouth of the mine shaft about 50 yards to their right, and beyond that, The mountains sloped away into wilderness. "Remember what I told you," he said, checking his gun. 6 bullets left. "Not much, but it would have to do. Stay together, keep moving, and when you reach help, tell them about this place. Tell them about the others." Sarah's eyes widened. "Others?" "The journal upstairs. There are more locations, more kids." The weight of that knowledge sat heavy on his shoulders. Even if they escaped today, this was bigger than just one cabin, one group of monsters. The first man emerged from the cave opening just as the children reached the tree line. Jake recognized him, the one who'd been giving orders back at the cabin, military-style haircut and cold eyes that had seen too much violence. The man raised his rifle, taking aim at the fleeing children. Jake's shot echoed across the mountainside, and the man dropped into the snow. The others would be more cautious now, but it bought the kids precious time. 2 more figures appeared at the cave mouth, using the rocks for cover. Jake was exposed on the open slope, but he had the high ground. He fired again, forcing them back, then began moving laterally, trying to draw their attention away from the children's escape route. A bullet whined past his ear, close enough that he felt the displacement of air. These weren't amateurs. They knew how to shoot, how to move, how to kill. Jake dove behind an outcropping of rock just as more shots peppered the snow around him. 4 bullets left. He risked a glance toward the tree line and felt a surge of relief. The children had disappeared into the woods, their small forms swallowed by the dense pines. Whatever happened next, at least they had a chance. Static crackled from somewhere nearby. One of them was calling for backup. Jake closed his eyes, thinking about the long chain of bad decisions that had led him to this moment. Funny how the best thing he'd ever done might also be the last. The sound of approaching footsteps crunched through the snow, surrounding his position. Jake gripped his gun tighter and prepared to make his final stand count. The helicopter's rotors cut through the dawn air as Marcus watched the last of the rescued children being loaded onto stretchers. 6 kids, all alive, all going home. The medics worked with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, wrapping them in thermal blankets, whispering reassurances. He stood apart from the chaos, his leather jacket torn and blood-stained, feeling oddly hollow despite the success. Sheriff Collins approached, her badge glinting in the pale morning light. "We found 3 more bodies in the lower tunnels," she said quietly. "Brings the total to 8 victims we can confirm. Could be more." Marcus nodded, watching as little Sarah, the girl who'd clung to him in the darkness, was carefully lifted into the aircraft. She turned and waved at him through the window, her small face breaking into the first smile he'd seen from any of them. Something tight in his chest loosened. "The survivors are talking," Collins continued. "They say you got them out, that you fought off their captors single-handedly." "Wasn't single-handed," Marcus replied, thinking of the ranger who'd died getting them this far, of the children's own courage in following him through those nightmare tunnels. "Took all of us." The sheriff studied him with calculating eyes. "My radio's been busy this morning. Seems there's quite a bit of interest in Marcus Reaper Henley. Outstanding warrants, association with known criminals, suspected involvement in multiple felonies." Marcus felt the familiar weight of his past settling over him like a shroud. He'd known this moment would come, had accepted it the second he'd decided to help those kids instead of walking away. "I won't run," he said simply. "Funny thing about those warrants," Collins continued, pulling out a tablet. "System seems to be experiencing some technical difficulties. Files corrupted, evidence misplaced. Happens sometimes in small departments with old equipment." She tapped the screen, and Marcus watched his mugshot disappear. Computer glitch. Terrible thing. Their eyes met, and Marcus saw something he wasn't used to seeing from law enforcement. Respect, maybe even gratitude. Why? Because those children are alive because of you. Because sometimes the law isn't the same thing as justice. She tucked the tablet away. "Besides, far as I can tell, Marcus Henley died in those tunnels. Don't know who you are now, but that's between you and whatever name you choose to go by." The helicopter lifted off, carrying its precious cargo toward the hospital in Denver. Marcus watched until it disappeared beyond the mountain peaks, taking with it the children who'd somehow managed to save him as much as he'd saved them. Collins handed him a card. "There's a veterans counselor in Boulder. Good man. Works with folks trying to start over. Might be worth a call." Marcus pocketed the card, knowing he'd use it. The nightmares would come. They were already starting, glimpses of dead eyes and children's screams echoing in quiet moments. But for the first time in years, he felt like he might be strong enough to face them. What about the cabin, the network these animals were part of? FBI's taking over the investigation. What you found in there, the evidence, the connections, it's going to bring down a lot of very bad people. Those kids' testimonies will make sure of it. Collins paused. "You did good work, Marcus. Real good work." As the sheriff walked away to coordinate with the federal agents now swarming the scene, Marcus retrieved his motorcycle from where he'd abandoned it days ago. The Harley started on the first try, its familiar rumble a comfort against the mountain silence. He rode slowly down the winding road, stopping once to look back at the cabin that had changed everything. Smoke still rose from its burned-out shell, carrying away the last physical traces of the horrors that had happened there. The children would heal, surrounded by families who'd thought they'd never see them again. The guilty would face justice. The dead could finally rest. At the bottom of the mountain, Marcus pulled into a truck stop and ordered coffee and a phone. The number on the counselor's card connected on the third ring. "Dr. Mitchell? My name's Marcus. Sheriff Collins gave me your number. Said you help people trying to start over." The voice on the other end was patient, kind. "I do my best. When would you like to come in?" Marcus looked out at the highway stretching endlessly in both directions, full of possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. For the first time since he could remember, he wasn't running toward something or away from it. He was just choosing a direction. How about today? As he hung up and walked back to his bike, Marcus realized the mountain's silence no longer felt oppressive. It felt peaceful. Behind him, 6 children were going home. Ahead of him, whatever came next would be his choice to make. The Reaper was dead. Marcus was just beginning to live.